Thank you. It's good to be here. I flew up here from Ohio today. It's good to be back for Wisconsin for a second time. I'm from the Midwest, actually. I'm a kid of immigrants, as you might have guessed. My dad came here about 40 years ago, and he settled in Southwest Ohio. And I had the question for him of, why of all places in the world would you come halfway around the world from India and settle in Cincinnati, Ohio? And he said that he needed to be near his sister, who lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and that was the only place he could find a job, at the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio, that was close to her. So that begged the question of why his sister came halfway across the world to Fort Wayne, Indiana. I never got a good answer, but we figured out it is the only U.S. state with the word India contained in the name of the state. So anyway, different parts of the Midwest. You guys are a kinder audience than I used to get when I used to do stand-up comedy in New York City for about 6 months. So I'll try another one on you that relates to the theme of the speech I'm going to give you. So Chairman Mao from China comes back to Earth in the year 2021, and he meets a farmer on the Chinese countryside, and he asks the farmer a few questions. He says, "Chinese farmer, whatever happened to those food shortages that we used to have back when I was president?" The farmer says, "Chairman Mao, we don't have that here anymore. In fact, we have food excess. Our people are dying of diabetes and obesity." To which Chairman Mao says, "Very good, very good." But whatever happened to those steel production targets that we set? We had a 50-year plan to defeat the United Kingdom in producing steel. Whatever happened to that? The farmer laughs and says, "Chairman, we produce more steel in the Hangzhou province than the entire United Kingdom." To which Mao says, "Very good." But he asks the final question, whatever happened to that Chinese Cultural Revolution, where the proletariat uprising was going to take place here in China? Whatever happened to that? And the farmer laughs, and he says, "Chairman Mao, we don't do that here anymore. We've outsourced it to the United States." And that relates to the theme of our conversation tonight. I'll actually take you back to this summer, when Simone Biles, one of the top gymnasts in U.S. history, stepped down from competition at the height of the Olympics in Tokyo, and a media culture that celebrated her for doing it. Just a couple months before, Naomi Osaka, probably the top female tennis player who had trained here in the United States, did nearly the exact same thing at the height of competition at the French Open. Was that entirely unrelated to the fact that Naomi Osaka gave up her U.S. citizenship just a couple of years earlier, as to why the media culture cheered her on? Was it entirely unrelated to the rise of intersectionality as a theory of how young black women were supposed to think about their identity? I don't think so. And it's not just in sports. Asian American kids are now taught in the classroom to hide their outward pursuit of excellence in math and science because it's not cool to be number one anymore. Standardized testing is ridiculed as racist. Talking about American exceptionalism is now considered off limits. You know what I say? I say the inner animal spirit at the heart of the American soul, the American animal, has been domesticated. It has been tamed by this new culture that penalizes excellence and celebrates mediocrity and victimhood. And the animal spirit that used to lift us up has traveled oceans to lift up places like China, while we have imported a culture of mediocrity that bring us all down. And I personally think that when we rallied behind the cry to make America great again, we didn't just hunger for a single man, we hungered for the revival of the unapologetic pursuit of excellence in America today. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so. And as I do, I'm going to take you back to 1993 to kick off, back when I was in second grade at Evendale Elementary in Ohio. And I remember the moment in 1993 when I heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said, "I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they are judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And I'll tell you something. That speech, it stuck with me. It meant something to me because it was the dream that allowed my dad to come to this country 40 years ago and build a successful career for himself at the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio, despite the fact that he had a thick Indian accent. He still does to this day. It was the dream that allowed me to go in a single generation from being the kid of Indian immigrants who came to this country with almost no money to becoming the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. And I had the privilege of leading that company as CEO for 7 years. We got drugs to patients. The one I'm most proud of is an FDA-approved drug for prostate cancer. But thank you. But I stepped down as CEO of that company earlier this year to focus on a different kind of cancer, not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that threatened to kill that dream that Martin Luther King had 60 years ago, that threatened to kill the dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever have in this country. And they teach you in medicine that in order to understand a cancer, you got to go to the root causes of that cancer. And the root causes of that cancer didn't begin here in the United States. It began in the last century across an ocean with the two most toxic ideologies of the 20th century. The first of those was German Nazism, identity politics on steroids. The second of them was Soviet Marxism, which was an oppressor-oppressed narrative on steroids. You combine the two, and you get their love child of wokeism right here on modern American soil. And I will tell you, this is a new secular religion in our country. You heard about it from my friend Buck. It is a new secular religion in our country whose belief system centers on the idea that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country, that if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged, that if you're white, you're inherently privileged, no matter your economic background, no matter how much money you have, no matter your upbringing, your race and your gender govern who you are and what you're allowed to think. You are a prisoner of the color of your skin. And you don't need to take it from me. You can take it directly from the high priests of this new religion. Take Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, a member of the Squad, who famously said a year and a half ago that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice, that we don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. And I guess I don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. But there's a really clever move she makes in there. Because when your race goes from being about your skin color to being about your voice, then any disagreement with that voice, that perspective, automatically becomes defined as racist. In fact, today, if you say that I'm not racist, that actually means you are racist. If you say that all lives matter, somehow that means that you believe that black lives don't matter. If you capitalize the W in white, or you fail to capitalize the B in black, as of the Associated Press saying so last year, you are also a racist. And there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So when given the choice between pledging allegiance to this new religion and being tarred with that scarlet R, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that has created a new culture of fear in this country. Fear of losing your job. Fear of your kids getting a bad grade in school. Fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. And that culture of fear has completely replaced our culture of free speech in America. And I'll tell you what, the best measure of the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And right now, We are doing abysmally on that metric. According to a recent survey conducted by the Cato Institute that included Republicans, Democrats, and independents, over 60% of Americans, I want you to pause for a second and think about that number, over 60% of Americans say they were afraid of expressing their true beliefs in public because of the current political environment. That is not America. That is not the country that my parents came halfway across the world to join. That is not the country I want to see America become. We have a new red guard in this country, except instead of spreading that Chinese philosophy of Marxism, they are now spreading this new philosophy of wokeism, where in the name of diversity, we have completely sacrificed true diversity of thought. In the name of inclusion, we have created a new exclusionary culture where certain points of view just aren't welcome. In the name of democracy, we have sacrificed our most important democratic ideals of free speech and open debate. And the question I'm going to turn to next is how the heck we got here. How did wokeness go from being about challenging the system to becoming the system? The answer actually, in my opinion, traces partly back to the 2008 financial crisis. Because after the 2008 crisis, you'll remember this. What the old left wanted to do was to take money from those wealthy corporations and redistribute it to poor people to help poor people. Agree or not, that is what the old left had to say. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had some sympathy to the frustration that the old left had with a crony capitalist system that rewarded bankers when times were good but bailed them out when times were bad. I understood where they were coming from. Occupy Wall Street was knocking at Wall Street's doorstep, and if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street was a pretty tough pill to swallow. But then something else happened. Right around 2008, around the election of Barack Obama, around the change in tides of this country, there was a strand of the left that said something different. They said, actually, the real problem wasn't quite economic injustice. It wasn't quite poverty. No. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And guess what? That actually presented the opportunity of a generation for big business in this country. Because if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street's pretty tough. But the new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. You put some token minorities on your boards. You muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos. It's actually pretty easy. It's a good game to play if you can get the work. But they did not do it for free. They effectively expected that the new Democratic Party look the other way when it came to leaving their corporate power intact. And that's the story of how you had a bunch of woke millennials get in bed with a bunch of big banks. Together they birthed woke capitalism, and they used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And it worked so well for them that their friends in Silicon Valley got in on the act and copied the same thing. They realized that the old threat to big tech used to come from the left, used to come from the Democratic Party. So what do they say? Okay, we're going to make a trade. We're going to use our corporate power to advance the values of the new left to censor, or in their language, moderate, any content you don't want to see online, but we don't do it for free. Because we effectively expect that the new Democratic Party looks the other way when it comes to leaving their monopoly power intact. You see, that's how the rules of this new arranged marriage work. It is not a marriage of love. It is more like mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act is the birth of what I call the woke industrial complex, a new force in American life that is far more powerful than big government or big business alone, because it is a combination of the two that can do what neither one can do on its own. And so the rest of corporate America gets in on the act too. That's how you get to Coca-Cola preaching about a new voting law in Georgia that makes it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, teaching its employees how to be less white, as they were earlier this year, while saying nothing of their own product's impact on the nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, including in the black community that they profess to care so much about. It's how you get to Nike, criticizing slavery 250 years ago in the United States without doing a thing to reduce its reliance on slavery today to source $250 sneakers from China that they sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this new game is played. Now, I've got some bad news for you. In the last few years, there is a new actor who showed up on the scene and who turned this arranged marriage into a three-party affair. And that is the Communist Party of China. And I will tell you, they understand this game far more deeply than any of us do. There's even a new Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo. It literally refers to woke left white people in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. But even worse, they are now using that as a tool to undermine our standing on the global stage, taking aim at our greatest geopolitical asset of all. That is not our nuclear arsenal. It is America's moral standing. And if you have any doubt about that, I'm going to ask you to listen real closely to what they are saying. Take Xi Jinping last year, pressed by the EU and the UN on the Uyghur human rights crisis, where there are over 1 million Uyghurs enslaved in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse. And the first thing that comes out of Xi Jinping's mouth is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. You think that's an accident? It's not. His top diplomat comes here to the Alaska summit earlier this year and lectures us for 15 minutes about how China wants to see the U.S. stop slaughtering, that is his word, slaughtering black Americans, and how China hopes the U.S. does better on human rights. Now, that would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own corporations give credibility to his claims by rampantly criticizing the United States without saying a peep about China. You take Disney. Just 2 years ago says it cannot film in the state of Georgia if Georgia passes the equivalent of a heartbeat bill, a new anti-abortion statute. But just last year, Disney goes to the Xinjiang province of China, literally ground zero of the Uyghur human rights crisis, and they film Mulan there without saying a peep until the very end of the movie, where they finally mustered up the courage to include in their credits to the film a statement of thanks to the local CCP authorities for allowing us the privilege of filming there, they say. That's Disney. The NBA is even worse. You remember, actually a couple of years ago, Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets dared to tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the first person who came to China's public defense was none other than my fellow Ohioan, LeBron James, who came to China's defense and denounced Daryl Morey for daring to stand with Hong Kong. So you ask yourself, why do these celebrities and their company and corporate hirers do what they do? The answer is really simple. It comes down to money. Because you see, if you're the CCP, you build a great Chinese wall to prevent any company from entering China if you're criticizing the CCP, but you roll out the red carpet to a company that criticizes the United States. You see, this dates back to the 1990s, to a mistake that we made in this country, Republicans and Democrats alike, where we thought under the philosophy of democratic capitalism, we could use the spread of capitalism to spread democracy. We thought that we could export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to spread democracy to places like China. We thought we could use our money to get them to be more like us. Well, guess what? They turned that game on its head. And now they've realized that they can use their money to get us to be more like them. In fact, it's one step worse than that. They have realized that they can use our money to get us to be more like them. And it has worked. They have turned our own companies into Trojan horses. We sent the Big Macs and Happy Meals. They sent back Nike sneakers and Disney movies as Trojan horses to undermine the United States from within. And if you have any doubt about that, look at the way they've now done it to deflect accountability for the origin of this pandemic. No accountability to this day. You got to ask yourself why. Just go back to remind yourself of the name of this virus. I'm a biologist by background, as you heard. I know a little something about viruses and what they're called. The Zika virus is named after the forest where it came from. The Ebola virus or the West Nile virus are named after the rivers where they came from. The Marburg virus, named after a town in Germany where it originated. The Japanese encephalitis virus, named after, as you probably guessed, Japan, where it came from. Even for COVID-19, early on, you could say the UK strain, you could say the South African strain, you could say the Brazilian strain, you could say the Indian double mutant strain. All of that was perfectly fine. But if you said the Wuhan virus, you were immediately bashed as a racist and a bigot. Ask yourself why. The CCP has weaponized not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the woke pandemic to create a false equivalence between Chinese nihilism and American idealism. And when that happens, nihilism wins every time. Thank you, LeBron James. Thank you, Disney. Thank you, NBA. So let's keep score for a second. Who wins this game? Corporations win, woke activists win, the Chinese Communist Party wins. The real losers of this game are the American people and American democracy itself. And so what I'd like to do is to turn from the problem towards what we actually do to solve that problem. And as I do, I want to remind all of you of one of my heroes in the conservative movement, Ronald Reagan, who 40 years ago, God bless him, did what he needed to do to defend liberty and prosperity in his era. He cut taxes. He slashed government regulations. He did what he needed to do to defend liberty and prosperity in his era. But I also want to remind you of a quote from my favorite Republican, who spoke 160 years ago, Abraham Lincoln, who famously reminded us that the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. That's what Lincoln said. Well, you know what I say? The dogmas of 1980 are inadequate to address the unique challenges that we face in the year 2021. We need new solutions to address the new threats to liberty in this country. And nowhere more do we get started than in talking about the issue of big tech censorship over the last year. '80s wisdom would tell you that these are private companies, and they're free to decide what does and doesn't show up on their websites. You know what I say to that? Bullshit. That's, well, you said that for the right reason, because if they were acting as private companies, I got no problem with it. But they're not acting as private companies today. These are companies who are working hand in glove with the party in power, responding to their threats, coordinating with the White House, protected by a special form of federal governmental immunity to do through the back door what government cannot directly do through the front door under the Constitution. So I say that if it is state action in disguise, then the Constitution still applies. These companies ought to be bound by the First Amendment when they're acting in concert with the government to do what government cannot do. We need to start that today. Thank you. Now those same companies then go to the offline world and they fire their employees for saying the wrong thing at work. How many workers were fired last year alone for wearing a Donald Trump hat to work? Even from a Virginia shipyard was a worker fired last year for wearing that hat. Well, you know what I say? If you can't discriminate on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation or religion or national origin, then you should not be able to discriminate on the basis of somebody's political speech either. We need to make political belief a civil right in this country, right up there in the civil rights statutes. Thank you. Now, the way I used to think, let me tell you about the way I used to think about this. 10 years ago, I would say actually the market should solve these problems, because if all these businesses are firing these great conservatives, well, that's an opportunity for these other businesses. And the last thing we should want to do is impose another law that tells businesses how to do business. I think there's a point to that line of thinking. But here's what I say. We cannot apply those standards in a way that isn't even-handed anymore. Maybe we don't need protected classes in this country at all. Maybe we should leave it to the market, but that ship sailed long ago. So long as you cannot discriminate against somebody or fire somebody or deplatform somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or whatever, then you should not be able to fire somebody or deplatform somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative either. And that is not an academic issue. If it can happen to the 45th President of the United States, it can happen to anybody. So that's the first category of solutions, legal and policy solutions. We need a Republican Party with a spine that can actually stand up to the places where they've had their bread buttered. But legal and policy is just the tip of the spear. That's just symptomatic therapy. I'm going to talk about 3 more categories of solutions before I hand it off. The next category of solutions is through private enterprise itself. So what we have right now is a problem in the marketplace, and it's got to be a problem that's also, in part, solved through businesses in the private sector. And I'm conflicted about this one, because I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't want to see the rise of 2 economies in this country. I don't like the fact that we have a right-wing version of coffee and a left-wing version of coffee. I don't like the fact that we may in the future be headed towards a right-wing version of baseball and a left-wing version of baseball after what the MLB did earlier this year. I don't want 2 economies, because the private sector is one of those places where we come together, irrespective of whether we're black or white or Democrat or Republican. That's what we do in the football and baseball and basketball stadiums of this country. That's how it's supposed to work. But I'll also say this. We're not starting from neutral territory today. We're starting from a new point in which most of big business in this country has already embraced an orthodoxy at one far end of the political and cultural spectrum. And that's going to require actual credible business leaders to step up and be unafraid about what they stand for. Businesses that say, in a way that is unapologetic, the fact that we believe in one nation under God, that we believe that the content of your character trumps the color of your skin, that we believe capitalism is the best system known to mankind to lift people up out of poverty, and we will not apologize for it. That's going to require some spine from our business leaders. Now, it's not just our government, it's not our private sector. I actually want to talk about probably the most important battlefront of all, the third one, in education. Today, we want our kids to love America, we say, but how can they love America without first learning what made America lovable in the first place? Our schools are teaching our children to be ashamed of our history rather than to be proud of it. Now, I'm going to talk about, at the last meeting that I had, that I came to here in Wisconsin, we talked a lot about the critical race theory movement in schools. I loved what happened earlier this week. I'm not going to repeat what I said there. But I do want to talk to a conservative movement, all of you, about how we ought to talk about this issue. Because you know you have been gaslighted for the last year, where when you say you are teaching critical race theory in the schools, the first thing they'll say is, oh, no, that's not critical race theory. That's just diversity training and teaching our history. Well, you know what my advice to the conservative movement is? We should stop using the words critical race theory. I don't care if you call it critical race theory or Schmidtical race theory. If you're teaching kids to think of themselves as oppressors or oppressed based on the color of their skin, that is ruining the next generation of Americans. That's what we need to be focusing on. And I also think we need to do better as a movement to talk not just about what we don't want to see taught in our schools, but what we do want to see taught in our schools. Let's see a revival of civic education and civic service in this country woven into primary education. I'm going to tell you a story. I actually met a high school student earlier this year who tried to convince me that we needed to tear down the Jefferson Memorial because Thomas Jefferson was a racist slaveholder. And I tried every argument I could, telling him that you can't judge our founding fathers by the standards of the present, just like you wouldn't want to be judged by the standards of the future 250 years from now, that somebody shouldn't be judged by their worst deed, that these were the people who gave rise to the Declaration of Independence that echoed through our civil rights movement. None of that. None of that landed with him. But here's what I did tell him. All right, we can agree to disagree on that. But instead of tearing down the statue of Thomas Jefferson, why don't we just build one for John Adams instead? He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the second president of the United States. He was an abolitionist on principle and stood for the abolition of slavery. He didn't own a slave, neither did his wife over the course of their lives. Rather than tearing down the statue of this guy, Why don't we build a statue for the other guy instead? And that actually got us to the table. And I'll tell you about a story I learned earlier this year that they don't teach in the classroom today. They didn't even teach in the classroom when I was in the classroom, about John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, who was the first non-founding father president of the United States, who was the only president in our history who went on to serve in Congress after he had left the White House because his work wasn't done. He went back to Congress with one mission alone. That was to abolish slavery. And you want to talk about cancel culture in the Democratic Party today? Boy, was there cancel culture in the Democratic Party of 1830. There was actually a rule called the gag rule in Congress where you could not mention slavery on the Congress floor without being censured. Where here you had a guy who actually had nothing to lose. He'd been president of the United States. He went back to abolish slavery. You know what he did? He said slavery, slavery, slavery all over the Congress floor until he got himself censured. And then he uses his trial for getting kicked out of Congress to make the case for abolition. 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 2 weeks of his personal defense, uses that to make the case for abolition. By the end of the trial, they had actually gotten rid of that gag rule. He died. Just a couple of years later, about a year later, he died in the middle of giving a speech on the Congress floor. He had a stroke. They took him up to the congressional anteroom for 2 more days while they tried to keep him alive. Finally, they couldn't keep him alive any longer. He died in the Capitol, in that Capitol in which he served in that second phase of his career. And he inspired his colleagues so much that when they took roll of who was going to carry out his funeral rites, who was going to carry him out and lead his funeral procession, there was a little-known first-term congressman who raised his hand and said that he would do it. None other than Abraham Lincoln, who took inspiration from John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, that signer of the Declaration of Independence. These are the stories of American history that we need to be teaching our kids in the schools. I never thought I would say it. I think we need to weave civic service into education to teach kids that you don't just inherit a country, you have to have a stake in building it. And I'll tell you, a lot on the left, a lot of people on the left like to talk about redistribution of wealth. Not a big fan of that, in part because I think a culture of excellence demands inequality of outcomes as long as we start in the same place. But here's where I do come around. And as conservatives, I think we ought to do better in starting a conversation that we haven't had in this country. Not so much about the redistribution of wealth, but about the redistribution of duty in this country. Now, we have a country in which I watched just a few weeks ago, was it? The hurricane that had hit Louisiana, far worse than Hurricane Katrina. The next morning were the National Guardsmen lifting them out. And I wondered, what is so different about them from me or my kids? What is so different about the people who have welcomed into their home our Afghan allies, who, by the way, I believe we have a civic obligation to bring back people to this country who put their own lives and their families' lives at risk to fight for this country. We have a civic duty to do right by them, by the way. But I also believe that our civic duties should be borne evenly, and we shouldn't just be sending them to Central Ohio. We shouldn't just be sending them to Wisconsin. Let's send them to Martha's Vineyard. Let's send them to the Hamptons. Let's send them to Hollywood. Let's send them to Silicon Valley, because we bear our duties equally as citizens. And against that backdrop, we're okay where some people end up winning the game of capitalism or winning the game of sports or the game of school or music better than others, because that's what the pursuit of excellence demands in our country. Which brings me to the final solution that begins not in any one institution, but in our culture. Our schools have been teaching our kids to be ashamed of our history rather than to be proud of it. Faith in this country is on the decline. Patriotism has nearly disappeared. We have an entire generation, my generation, millennials and younger, who are hungry for a sense of purpose, hungry for a cause, hungry for meaning, hungry for identity. But the kinds of things that used to fill that void in our hearts, like faith and patriotism and hard work and family, have nearly disappeared, such that we have a God-sized hole in our heart, and when something like God doesn't fill that void, something else fills it instead. That is what makes wokeism the equivalent of our modern opium for the American soul. Ask the question, what does it even mean to be an American in the year 2021? I cannot remember a time in my life where we more badly needed an answer to that question. We have come off of a decade of celebrating our diversity and our differences that we have forgotten all of the ways that we are actually the same as one people. And make no mistake, our diversity is a beautiful thing. But I think our diversity is meaningless if there is nothing greater that binds us together across that diversity. Without something greater that binds us together across our differences and our diversity, we're nothing more than a different looking group of higher mammals roaming a common geographic space, doing what our iPhones told us to do on a given day. That is not America. America isn't even a place. It is a vision of what that place can be. It is an idea that brought together a divided, polyglot group of people 250 years ago, and at the top of that vision, at the top of that list of ideas, was the dream that I told you about at the very beginning. The American dream. The idea that no matter who you are, or where your parents came from, or what your skin color is, you can achieve anything you ever want in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, and your own dedication. That is the American dream. Thank you. Now, the other side will say that that's just a load of high-minded drivel because America has never lived up to those ideals. America has always been hypocritical. America has always fallen short. You know what I say? Somewhere, deep down in there, they have a point. America isn't perfect. America wasn't perfect at its founding. America will never be perfect because more so than any nation, America was born on the idea that on God's green earth, perfection is impossible. That is why we have a system of checks and balances. But also, more so than any nation in human history, America is about the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. Those are the values that won the American Revolution. Those are the values that reunited us after the Civil War. Those are the values that won us World War I and World War II and the Cold War. Those are the values that still give hope to the free world. And if we can revive those common values over fractious group identity, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus is going to defeat us. That is what true American exceptionalism is all about, and that is what we will need to revive in order to defeat this cultural epidemic. Thank you. God bless you. God bless your families. God bless the United States. Thank you.